Thanks, Bethany. And it's good to be here, and I appreciate, Charlotte, I appreciate the museum hosting us today. And I really appreciate all the hard work of the Arkansas chapter, because they do many great things. So, but as Bethany mentioned, I have a background in Cherokee history. So because of that, I have the interest in the Greenwood, my interest in the Greenwood race riot was to see how many freedmen and their families of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee nations were impacted. I looked, this will be difficult for you to see, but first I looked at the 1920 U.S. Census for the Greenwood district of Tulsa, and without doing a detailed analysis, it appears that it's only about 10 to 15% of the residents were freedmen. Almost all of them had come in about the time of statehood and had been Oklahoma residents for less than 20 years, 15 to 20 years. This was based on looking at the adults who were listed as being born in Oklahoma, as well as their parents being born in Oklahoma. As you can see, the birth is over here, so you can see Oklahoma for many of these. So this was a freedman family. But first I'd like to give you a background on slavery in the Indian nations, particularly the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokees operated under clan law. There were 7 Cherokee clans, and each person belonged to the clan of their mother. If a Cherokee was killed by another Cherokee, even if it was by accident, then someone from the killer's clan must be killed to keep balance within the clans. While it was generally the person who did the killing, it could be someone close to him, such as his brother, but it always had to be someone from within the clan. Since the other tribe had killed Cherokee warriors in battle, then the captives often were put to death to keep things in balance. Sometimes, however, the captives were made slaves by the captor. And while the person was a slave for a while, and sometimes for life, most of the time they're eventually adopted by a clan and thus became a Cherokee citizen. Many of them took Cherokee wives, had a white wife back in the white settlements or towns. Of course, their children by the Indian wife were Cherokee, since they belonged to the clan of their mother. These traders introduced black slaves into the Cherokee Nation. And many of these slaves came directly from Africa. There are accounts of several slaves in the early 19th century of the Cherokee Nation who are recorded as being born in Africa. The Cherokees then began to take the same attitude towards slaves as the white traders and other white plantation owners. There is, however, an interesting court case in the Cherokee Supreme Court in the 1830s. In the latter part of the 18th century, a white trader named Sam Dent married a Cherokee woman of the Deer clan, and he beat her to death. But knowing that he would be put to death under the clan law for her death, he escaped back to the white settlements. There he purchased an African-American slave named Molly, which he brought back into the Cherokee Nation and offered her to the Deer clan as a replacement for the wife whom he had killed. The Deer clan accepted her, and thus she became a member of the Deer clan. In the early 1830s, a white woman came to the Cherokee Nation and claimed Molly and her sons, Isaac and Edward Tucker, as her property. She claimed that Sam Dent had sold Molly to her father and that she was entitled to Molly and her issue as her slaves. The Cherokee Supreme Court refused to recognize her claim. They stated that Molly had been adopted into the Deer clan, and therefore she and her children were Cherokee citizens. And there are many Cherokee citizens to this day that are descended from Molly. And there was no hesitation on the part of the Supreme Court to recognize the citizenship of Molly, in spite of a Cherokee law being passed earlier, which stated, it was Newtown, which is now Neoshoda in Georgia, November the 11th, 1824. Resolved by the National Committee and Council that intermarriage between Negro slaves and Indians or whites shall not be lawful, and any person or persons permitting and approbating his, her, or their Negro slaves to intermarry with Indians or whites, be she or they so offending, shall pay a fine of $50, one half for the benefit of the Cherokee Nation. And be it further resolved that any male Indian or white man marrying a Negro woman slave, he or they shall be punished with 59 stripes on the bare back, and any Indian or white woman marrying a Negro man slave shall be punished with 25 stripes on her or their bare back. So this was passed 8 to 10 years before the Supreme Court recognized the rights of Mali. At this time, the majority of the Cherokees lived in the southeast, although a few of the Cherokees had begun to immigrate west of the Mississippi River in the late 18th century. Several others immigrated during the early 19th century. And by 1835, approximately 3,000 Cherokees lived west of the Mississippi. A census was taken of those Cherokees in the east, which showed that there were 16,542 Cherokees, 1,592 slaves, 201 white intermarriages. Just under 9% of the population were slaves. And great pressure was being put on the Cherokee Nation for the ceding of all their lands in the east and their removal to the west of Mississippi. The white people wanted the farms and plantations of the Cherokees. A handful of Cherokees had no authority to do so, signed a treaty in late December of 1835, ceding all of their lands in the east. This fraudulent treaty was approved by the U.S. Senate and signed by President Jackson on May 23rd of 1836. The treaty resulted in the forced removal of the Cherokees to the west on what became known as the Trail of Tears, and their slaves were removed with them. By the way, I had intended to tell you at the beginning of the presentation, under your chairs are clipboards, and if you have any questions, you can write on those and then pass them forward, and we'll look at try to answer them at the end of the presentation. So after removal, the Cherokees rebuilt their nation and prospered on their new lands until the U.S. Civil War. And this is Cherokee Nation West in present northeastern Oklahoma. When all the federal troops were removed from the Indian Territory in 1861, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, and a portion of the Muskogee Nation signed treaties with the Confederacy. The Cherokees attempted to remain neutral, but with no support from the federal government, they were eventually forced to sign a treaty with the Confederacy. However, when federal troops returned to Indian Territory in 1862, our principal chief, John Ross, with most of his followers, welcomed them. Time will not allow to go into details about the Civil War in Indian Territory, but suffice it to say that the majority of the Cherokees then joined the Indian Home Guards and fought with the federal troops. The Cherokee Tribal Council approved an Emancipation Proclamation in February of 1863, freeing all slaves within the nation, to become effective on the 25th of June, 1863. And this was well before the legal abolition of slavery by the U.S. with the ratification of the 13th Amendment on the 6th of December, 1865. Most of the Cherokee families, siding with the North, refugeed in Kansas in 1862 and 1863. And following the Cherokee Emancipation Proclamation, many, if not most of the slaves also refugeed in Kansas. Some, however, had been taken south by their owners before this into the Choctaw Nation and even further south into Texas. Each of the 5 tribes were forced to sign a new treaty with the U.S. in 1866. All of these treaties, with the exception of the Chickasaws, provided that the former slaves of each of these nations were to be granted the same rights as citizens of those tribes. The Cherokee Treaty was proclaimed on August 11, 1866. It provided that any former slaves must return to the Cherokee Nation within 6 months from that date in order to be eligible for these rights. This date of February 11, 1867, became very important in establishing their citizenship later in the Cherokee Nation. They frequently had to prove that they were back in the nation, even when the final rolls of the Dawes Commission for the allotment of land were made in the early 1900s. So this brings us back to the 1920 U.S. Census for Greenwood District to look at one of the freedmen families of the Cherokee Nation. And here we have the one that we were looking at earlier. Well, the earlier slide showed that they were born, for example, Mary Hogg, the mother-in-law. Well, she was born in Oklahoma, and her parents were also born in Oklahoma. But looking at this, and note that Rachel, and that she and both her parents were born in Oklahoma. The same information is shown for her mother, Mary Hogg, and her brother, Andrew Weber. Note that their address on that census was 122 North Hartford. And Hartford is 1 block east of Greenwood in Tulsa. The 100 block of Greenwood was where many of the main businesses were located. So using this information of the U.S. Census, I was able to locate them on the Cherokee Freedmen roll. So this is the census card for Mary Weber. And it shows on the first page is her and her children. Then the next page shows that her father was Andy Weber, and that the father's owner was Robert Weber, and her mother was Rachel Lassie. And Rachel was owned by Johnson Whitmire. So the census card for Andrew Weber, Rachel's father, he shows that he was a slave of Robin Weber, and Robin Weber was also his father. And his mother was Cindy Weber. Now there's Dawes' testimony in connection with the census cards. And the one for Mary Weber, part says, by the way, for Mary Weber, there are 86 pages of testimony. And this is just one of the pages here, which says, what is your name? Mary Ann Weber. What is your age? 26. Post office address is Chelsea. And what district did she live in, which is Gooey. Do you apply to be enrolled as a Cherokee Freedman? Yes, sir. And who do you desire to have enrolled besides yourself? It's 3 children. Did your name on the roll of 1880? It says, no, sir. Are you married? No, sir. What's your father's name? Andy. Mother's name? Rachel Whitmire. And is your father living? Yes. And the mother? No. So it goes on and gives more information about her family. And most of it deals with when her family returned from Kansas, to be sure they were back by that February 1867 date. There are several testimonies that were given in other applicants whose family returned at the same time. And this testimony is by a Cherokee, C.B. Rogers, and he talks of meeting a group returning from Kansas. So C.B. Rogers, being duly sworn, testified as follows. This is, tell them your name, C.B. Rogers, age 63 years old, place of residence, Claremore. Are you a citizen of the Cherokee Nation? Yes, sir. How long have you been such? All my life, a little over 63 years. Did you go out of the country during the war? Yes, sir. When did you return? In 66. Where did you come to? I came to Fort Gibson. And stayed there, did you? Yes, sir. Well, what was your business? It says, after I came back? Yes. Well, I followed freighting for something over 3 years. Where between what places? Sedalia and Pleasant Hill and Kansas City to Fort Gibson. Were you ever acquainted with a freedman by the name of Moses Whittaker? Yes, I know him. Where did he belong before the war? He belonged in Bowie State District. Do you know what particular Whittaker he belonged? He says, I don't remember whether he belonged to George or his brother Johnson Whittaker. He said, if you did see him, when did you first see Moses Whittaker after the war, after your return to the Cherokee Nation? He said, as well as I remember, it was in February of 68. I met them just on this side of the Neosho River as they were moving back to this country from Kansas. There were between 24 to 26 wagons. And I met them right on this side of the Neosho River. Dick Whitmire, Mose Whitmire, and Aaron Whitmire, and old Major Riot is all I know in the outfit. Did you have any conversation with them, stop and talk with them? Yes, sir, and Colonel Bill Ross passed while I was talking to them going to Fort Scott. Did you ask where they was going to? They said they were moving back. Well, this is 25 or more wagons, was loaded with people? Yes, mostly everyone had household goods in them. Colony of Cherokee Freedmen? Yes, coming back to the Cherokee Nation. So, of course, he was testifying that that was in 68, which had been a year later. But there's, and by the way, the C.V. Rogers is the father of Will Rogers. So, but in spite of his testimony, there was enough other testimony that proved that they came back in time, thus they were eligible for the enrollment on the census cards that we looked at earlier. There's also testimony from other members or family, and these can be used to piece together her entire family, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Additionally, their locations on earlier rolls are identified. And on Andrew Weber, there's 45 pages of testimony, which is the father of Mary. And he says, go through, he says, what is your name? Andrew Weber. How old are you? I don't know my age. Have you any idea? No, sir. Says it's on the Clifton roll as 43, I believe. What's your post office address? Shodo. What district of the Cherokee Nation are you living? Which is Saline. You apply for enrollment as a Cherokee Freedman? Yes, sir. Who did you belong to? Robin Weber. Was he a Cherokee? Yes, sir. Do you apply for anyone besides yourself? No, sir. What was your father's name? Robin Weber, the man that owned me. Is he living or dead? Dead. How long has he been dead? A long time. I don't know just how long. And what is your mother's name? This is Sunday, but it was actually Cindy Weber. Is she living or dead? She's dead. Was she a Cherokee Freedman? Yes, sir. And did she belong to Robin Weber? Yes, sir. Where were you born? In the Cherokee Nation on Caney. And how long have you been here? All the time. Did you leave the Cherokee Nation after the outbreak of the war? Yes, sir. Where did you go? To Kansas. How long did you stay there? Several years. When did you go there? Just before peace was made. And when did you come back? I came back in 66. How do you know it was 66? I knowed we had to come back on a certain time or we wouldn't have no right. So there's the Wallace roll, circa 1894 for Mary A. Weber, who's at the very top, and then some other family members are below. There's an 1860 slave schedule for Robert Weber found in Indian lands west of the Arkansas. And this is in Flint District, Cherokee Nation. And you'll see the Robert Weber there and his a list of the slaves by ages and whether they were male or female. Unfortunately, none of the slave schedules listed the names, but you can actually match up pretty close to the ages of Andrew Weber. And there's a similar one for Johnson Whitmire for Going Snake District of the Cherokee Nation. And on this, if let me look. The village right here is Aaron, Fort Creek. Johnson Whitmire plantation is right here, just south of Aaron, South Aaron, Fort Creek. And then this line here, when you think of Going Snake, it's actually Caney Creek. And the river indication was right there. So they were fairly close together there. So Johnson and George Whitmire were the sons of Charlotte Downing, and Johnson was the owner of the mother. They were the sons of Charlotte Downing and Stephen Whitmire. Both died when their sons were in their youth, and John Downing, Charlotte's brother, became their guardian. Charlotte was Cherokee, and Stephen was white. They immigrated west, and this was in March 22nd of 1832. There was a letter from the Superintendent of Cherokee Immigration, Benjamin Curry, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he says, in bringing the family of John Downing with the heirs of Charlotte Downing and their Negro property to this place, it was considered necessary to have a guard, and through the petition of General Coffee, a detachment of the Georgia Guards were directed to accompany us to this point. And in the immigration rolls, it shows there were 28 slaves along with John Downing and the Whitmire sons, and the sons were both listed as being under 10 years of age. And George Downing, his will was filed in Hall County, Georgia in 1818. And he's a half-breed Cherokee, and he leaves his daughter Charlotte Downing 32 slaves. And George Downing was a son of a British trader, John Downing, and his Cherokee wife. And remember what I said earlier, that African American slaves were introduced in the Cherokee Nation by the traders who lived among them. So we've come sort of full circle from those involved in the Tulsa race riot back to their introduction by the Cherokee traders in the mid-1700s. Interestingly, the Charleston Gazette in South Carolina recorded in April of 1760 the killing of John Downing by the Cherokees. The Cherokees were at war with the British and sought to kill all white men living within their nation. And when John Downing was captured, his half-breed son, George, who was age 16, was with him. John, the white man, white trader, had his hands and feet cut off and was burned at the stake. John's Cherokee wife and her 3 sons and daughter continued to operate the trading post and prospered. And by the way, I am descended from one of George's brothers, William Downing. My mother was a Downing. So I hope this gives you an indication of what can be found on the families of those freedmen and the Indian tribes who were victims of the Tulsa race riot. Thank you. So are there any questions? Yes.
Notice when you were talking about when going to Kansas.
Yes.
Kansas at that time was considered another country.
Well, it would have been outside the Cherokee Nation, so it would have been part of the United States.
Yeah, it's another country.
Right, basically, yes. So.
How much of the Greenwood district is covered by the Cherokee Nation?
Actually, none of it. Because I'm sorry, all of it was covered by the Cherokee Nation because the line was immediately south, because the majority of Tulsa is in the Muskogee Nation, but all of the Greenwood had been in the Cherokee Nation.
These are wonderful questions. I'll field them. That way we have a pretty good group of people online that can't hear the questions. So if you want to ask it, I'll ask it in the mic and then Jack can respond
okay.
if there are others.
Because he had asked how much of the Greenwood District was in the Cherokee Nation, and all of it was.
I'll ask a question, Jack.
Yes.
My question is, all of us know, and you know, that topics of race, identity, of this mixed race, Black Indian descent, is getting more attention now, but also still a pretty hot button topic. To what extent has the Cherokee Nation, which you're most familiar with, come to reconcile or recognize, or what's their position today on this deep-rooted history?
Right now, the Cherokee Nation recognizes all the Cherokee freedmen as Cherokee citizens. Now, the other tribes have not addressed it at this point. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Chickasaw Nation did not have to, or did in their 1866 treaty, they did not recognize their freedmen as citizens or give them the rights of citizenship or rights of citizens. Yes.
I'm one of those Cherokee freedmen. My grandfather was on the Dawes Roads, but my maternal grandmother was from, is it Choctaw? Choctaw? And it's harder to find her lineage. Which way would you advise me to research her?
Do you want me to restate, or you want to restate, Jack?
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So the question is, we've got someone in the audience that is a Cherokee freedman and has family ancestry, both, was it Choctaw and Cherokee? And there's less evidence, or it's harder to find the research in the Choctaw, and she's asking for some advice and counsel from Jack about doing this family research.
Actually, there are the census cards for the Choctaw freedmen, just like I showed for the Cherokees, and there's also testimony that goes with them. And all of that would be at the National Archives branch in Fort Worth, although they're on, you can find them on Fold 3, and there may be some of them on Family Search, but I do know they're on Fold 3, which is what I normally use.
Thank you.
Surely.
I have my own mic now, Jack.
Okay.
Are there other questions? That was great. Yes.
So I will say I am Choctaw, and right now Choctaw Nation is in the middle of addressing the descendants of freedmen. It is harder, but us as a nation, Chief Bat is trying to address that. He did make a newsletter, I want to say in May, maybe it was April or May, that us as a nation, we are addressing that. So I don't know when they will come to a decision, because they're, I hate to say the word battle, but they are in battle with the U.S. government at the moment.
Sure. And I'll just repeat that for online. We have a young lady in the audience who is a Choctaw citizen, and she said that the Chief Batten, right, had announced this spring that they are working with the freedmen and going to figure out that situation. But currently, actually, the Cherokee Nation went through this too, in terms of the federal battle. But he said, he announced they are going to work on the freedmen side and get it hammered out.
A little background on this presentation. I was asked to be part, as a grant consultant for Gilcrease, who has a fairly large grant, to put together all of the papers of Eddie Faye Gates, who was a resident of North Tulsa and did amazing work. She was a school teacher in the Tulsa public education system, but she was on the Tulsa Race Riot Commission that the state of Oklahoma did in 1999. And then they interviewed, she has a large number of interviews with, it's called the Tulsa Race Riot Survivors. She also interviewed a large number of people in North Tulsa for the history of North Tulsa. And then there are pictures or photographs. It's a huge collection of material. So there's, I believe, 4 of us that are advisors on that. And I put this together, and the grant is supposed to primarily to put her papers in order, but also to address other situations such as the forced removal of the 5 tribes, which is why I was asked to be a part of that. And I did that, and I know some people have asked why use the Tulsa race riot, and that's because in all these records, those early records, that's how it was referred to. But as we got closer to the 100th anniversary on May 31st, June 1st, people started using the term massacre, which probably is a much more accurate description. But that actually came about more after I did this initial presentation in February. But regardless of which term is used, it was a horrendous affair that should never have happened. But unfortunately it did. And I'm glad that it's being brought to the forefront of what happened. And it can be addressed, particularly with citizens of Tulsa, citizens of Oklahoma. Well, the world as general should know about it and address it, but primarily Oklahoma should make people aware of it as part of our history.
Jason?
How did Cherokee Nation report the race riot?
How did the Cherokee Nation report the race riot?
The Cherokee Nation was not operating as a government at that time. So the nation did not report anything because they did not operate as a government.
Jack, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
So you are the president, the leader of the National Trail of Tears Association,
Yes.
which, as I explained earlier, preserves the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, primarily for the Cherokee. So in your leadership role for the Trail of Tears Association and all this research you've done with the Freedmen and the race riot, what's the National Trail of Tears Association perspective or vision for bringing this history to life and educating the public about this?
Unfortunately, there are not a lot of records of the Cherokee slaves that accompanied the Cherokees on the forced removal. There are some indications. We want to tell the story more, but we just can't find the documentation. And also, many of the larger slave owners either sent their slaves by some other means, and they did not come on the trail with them. The ones that actually came on the forced removal were the ones that had I'd say under 10 or a few. But the large slave owners, many of them, such as the Whitmires, came before the forced removal, before the removal treaty of 35. So they came as old settlers. So a large number of them came as old settlers.
They mostly sided with the treaty signings. So once the treaty was ratified, they removed abolition compared to the forced removal.
So it's a good call for volunteers, if I make a plug here, because we literally still have research to do to bring history to life and educate the public about it. Anyone else? Other questions? I've got one more right here. Go ahead, Jenna.
Is there, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Is there any oral history regarding the freedmen? What capacity they may have been working? Did they own businesses? Were they possibly indentured in any way? What do we know about the individuals who you identified?
Do you want me to repeat the question, Jack?
If you like.
Great.
Yes.
The question is there any oral history about the freedmen, their occupations, their lives, just more details about the freedmen?
Are you referring to after the Civil War? Okay. There are a series of Indian Pioneer papers with many oral interviews of people that includes many of the freedmen of the different tribes. And those are actually online at the Western History Collection at the University of Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Historical Society, at the Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City, we have a set of the very same documents. There was a set placed at Oklahoma Historical Society and another set placed a carbon copy. Part of them are carbons. They're are at OU and the others there. but they're the same, but they're just filed in different orders, but it's the same documents. So you can go online and find those. There was also a great book by I believe it's a husband and wife by the name of Baker, that in no relation, but they did a fantastic job of the slave interviews for Oklahoma.
The University of Arkansas has the hard copy of the collection he's talking about, the WPA interviews, or from the Western Historical. There's a hard copy there as well. Yes, in the back.
There's also a history book called Oklahoma Black Cherokee that was written about 3 years ago. You can get it online.
Oklahoma Black Cherokee, a book online.
Yes.
Great. Co-editor, okay. Oklahoma Black Cherokee.
And who are the editors? Right.
Any other questions?
So, and I did, that was Ty, because I think I actually was on a Zoom meeting with him a couple of days ago.
Oh, great. Well, if there's no further questions, I'd like to give a round of applause to Jack Baker and his presentation.
Okay. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jack. As you can tell, lots of deep research. This is a huge part of what our association does in our chapter. We have some great researchers in the room that dig into the archives. Then we put the program together. And here's the cool thing, is that this type of research will it can make national change. We present this to the National Park Service, who manages the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. And then it impacts sites like the Museum of Native American History becoming a certified site. It impacts the route in which the official map designates the trail. So the type of grassroots research we do now impacts really the legacy of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. And with that, I'll close our program. Thank you all for coming. Please have any snacks or drinks in the back. And of course, Jack's here if you have any further questions. Thank you all.